I'd been driving for Uber Eats for about 6 months when this happened. It was decent money for myself as a college student, and I could work my own hours around my classes. The only downside was that the best tips usually came from late-night orders, which meant I often did deliveries in unfamiliar neighborhoods well past midnight. This particular night was no different. Around 2:30 a.m., I got a ping for what would be my last delivery of the night. The pickup was from a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, and the destination was about 20 minutes away in a residential area I'd never been to before. I pulled up to the diner. The place was nearly empty except for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and a cook visible through the kitchen window. I grabbed the order and headed back to my car, eager to finish this last run and get home. Google Maps led me through increasingly quiet streets as I drove toward the delivery address. The houses grew more sparse, with longer driveways and larger yards. Many of the properties were set back from the road, hidden behind tall hedges or clusters of trees. Street lighting became scarce, leaving long stretches of road illuminated only by my headlights. When I finally reached the address, I found myself staring at a modest 2-story house with dark windows. The driveway was empty, and no porch lights were on. A tall wooden fence surrounded the backyard. I parked at the curb and grabbed the food. The customer had requested that I bring the order to the side door rather than the front entrance. Walking up the driveway, I noticed how quiet everything was. The side door was tucked into a small alcove, partially hidden by an overgrown bush. I knocked gently, not wanting to wake anyone who might be sleeping inside. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness, but there was no immediate response from within the house. After waiting about 30 seconds, I knocked again, this time a bit more firmly. Still no answer. I pulled out my phone to call the customer, but noticed I had no signal. This wasn't entirely uncommon in some residential areas, but it added to my growing unease. I decided to wait a few more minutes before giving up and heading home. That's when I heard a weird sound coming from somewhere behind the house. I don't know how to describe it. I stood perfectly still, listening intently. The sound came again, followed by what might have been a muffled voice, though I couldn't make out any words. My first thought was that the customer might be in the backyard and hadn't heard me knocking. I called out softly, identifying myself as the delivery driver. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by complete silence. I walked around to the back of the house, following a narrow path that led to a small patio area. The backyard was larger than I'd expected, with a tool shed near the far fence and several pieces of outdoor furniture scattered around. Everything was bathed in shadows, making it difficult to see clearly. I called out again, explaining that I had their food order. This time, I heard a response. A man's voice telling me to leave the food on the patio table and go. The voice came from somewhere near the shed, but I couldn't see anyone in the darkness. Something about the tone of his voice made me uncomfortable. It was strained, almost breathless, as if he were exerting himself physically. I set the bag down on the table as requested and started to leave. But then I heard something that made me freeze. It was another voice, much quieter, almost a whisper. But this one sounded different, possibly female, and it carried a tone of distress that sent chills down my spine. The words were too soft to understand, but the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. I took a step closer to the shed, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The man's voice came again, telling me to leave immediately. But underneath his words, I could still hear that other voice. My heart began racing as I realized something was very wrong. This wasn't a typical late-night food delivery. The empty house, the customer hiding in the shadows, the second voice that sounded distressed. None of it made sense. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. As I reached the corner of the house, I heard the shed door creak open. I didn't wait to see what emerged from it. Instead, I ran. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys as I heard movement behind me. The engine seemed to take forever to start, and I could see a figure approaching in my rearview mirror. Finally, the car roared to life, and I drove away as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station several miles away. My hands were shaking as I tried to call the police, but I realized I didn't have enough information to give them. I didn't know what I'd actually witnessed. The next morning, I found news reports about a missing person case in that same neighborhood. A young woman had disappeared 3 days earlier. Her car had been found abandoned, but there had been no trace of her since then. I contacted the police and told them everything I could remember about the previous night. They investigated the property, but found it empty. The house belonged to an elderly couple who were apparently visiting relatives out of state. I never found out what happened to the woman who had gone missing. My cousin Sarah had asked me to watch her place while she was away with friends back in 2018. I was kind of in between jobs at the time, so it didn't really bother me. She lived in a quiet neighborhood about 40 minutes from my apartment. The house itself was a standard 2-story house. Sarah had given me a complete rundown before leaving on what I needed to pay attention to. She mentioned that her next-door neighbor, an elderly woman, was traveling that same weekend, so the area might be quieter than usual. Friday evening passed without incident. I ordered a pizza, watched Netflix with her cats, and went to bed around midnight in the guest room. Saturday started normally enough. I fed the cats, watered the plants, and spent most of the day reading in the backyard. As evening approached, I grilled some chicken on the deck and enjoyed myself as if I were on holiday. Around 10 o'clock, I went for a quick walk around the block. Sarah had mentioned the area was safe to do so, and I thought it would be nice to get some fresh air before settling in for the night. The streets were well lit, with most houses showing signs of life. I was about halfway around the block when I noticed something odd. The neighbor's house, the woman who supposedly wasn't at home, had lights on in the upstairs windows. I paused on the sidewalk and looked up to the windows, waiting to see if I could spot anyone, but I didn't catch any movement. I didn't want to sound the alarm too early. Maybe she had returned earlier than expected, or perhaps someone else was staying at her house, so I kept moving and returned back to Sarah's place. Back at the house, I locked the front door and settled onto the couch with both cats. I tried to focus on the movie I'd started, but my attention kept drifting to the windows facing the neighbor's property. From the living room, I could see directly into the older woman's backyard. The lights on the second floor weren't on anymore, leaving the house in darkness. Around 11:30, I saw a flashlight beam moving around in the neighbor's yard. Given the already strange feeling I had, this definitely struck me as weird. I got up and moved closer to the window, trying to get a better view. I saw a person wearing dark clothing, carrying the flashlight, and appeared to be examining the outside of the house. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but decided to wait and see what happens first. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, the person was going up and down the neighbor's house, obviously looking for the best way to enter. At one stage, he stopped in front of the basement window and knelt down. I couldn't exactly see what was going on, but a few minutes later, the flashlight went out and was staring into complete darkness. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see something in the darkness. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I saw a faint glow coming from inside the basement window. The person I had seen before had somehow opened the window and had entered the house. I decided not to wait any longer and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, giving them both addresses and describing what I was seeing. They told me to stay inside the house with the doors locked and that officers were on their way. Under no circumstances was I to go out and try anything myself. While waiting for the police, I kept watch from different windows. The light in the basement stayed on for at least 10 minutes before switching off again. The police arrived shortly after. I met them at Sarah's front door and explained everything I'd seen. After briefly listening to what I had to say, they told me to go back inside as they approached the building. I watched from the living room window as the officers used their own flashlights to examine the basement window, where I'd seen the person kneel down. The officers spent the next hour searching the neighbor's house and the surrounding area. They found the basement window had been pried open and several rooms had been disturbed, though it was unclear if anything had been stolen. The intruder was long gone by the time police arrived. I spent the rest of the night checking and rechecking every lock in Sarah's house, jumping at every small sound. I barely slept, constantly listening for any indication that someone might be testing the windows or doors. Sarah returned Sunday evening as planned, and I told her everything that had happened. She immediately called the neighbor, who was just as shocked but glad that she hadn't been home when this all happened. What I still can't explain to myself are the lights on the second floor that I saw during my walk around the block. This was well before the guy appeared in the backyard. I spoke to Sarah about it, and she passed it on to the neighbor, but so far no one has been able to come up with a reasonable explanation for it. All I know is that if I hadn't decided to take that evening walk, and later hadn't been looking out the window at just the right moment, the person would have gotten in and out of the house without me noticing anything. What terrifies me even more is that it could just as easily have happened to Sarah's house, possibly while I was out for my walk. I don't want to think about what might have happened if I had walked in and caught the person red-handed. I don't know if the police ever caught the guy, and I never found out what had been stolen from the house either. Sarah sold her place pretty shortly after that, and I've never been back to that neighborhood. This happened when I was driving back from a business conference a few weeks ago. The company I work for had offered to pay for a hotel room, but being only a few hours away, I decided to drive through the night to get home to my family. The conference had run late, ending around 11 at night, followed by some drinks that dragged on until midnight. By the time I reached my rental car in the hotel parking garage, I was completely exhausted. The smart choice would have been to stay overnight, but my daughter had a soccer game the next morning, and I'd promised to be there. The traffic was light on the interstate, mostly long-haul truckers and a few other late-night travelers like myself. At some stage, I took an exit that led to the mountain pass I had to get through. The 4-lane highway narrowed to 2 lanes, then began to climb through dense forest. Streetlights disappeared, leaving only my headlights to carve a tunnel through the absolute darkness. About 40 minutes into the mountain section, my car began making a noise I'd never heard before. It started as a subtle whining from the engine bay, barely audible over the radio. But within minutes, it grew into an unmistakable grinding sound that forced me to turn off the music and listen with growing concern. I pulled over at the next chance I got. It was a small gravel area carved into the mountainside. The engine bay was too hot to touch, steam rising from somewhere near the radiator. Even with my limited mechanical knowledge, I could tell something was seriously wrong. The car wasn't going anywhere without a mechanic. I checked my phone, but up in the mountains, it was no surprise that I didn't have any reception. I sat back in the driver's seat and thought about what to do. The nearest town was at least 20 miles behind me. Walking back down the mountain highway in total darkness seemed like an invitation for disaster, but staying here, hoping that someone would drive by, meant I might be stuck here all night. While I was weighing my options, I suddenly noticed headlights approaching from behind me. I looked back and saw the headlights of a vehicle in the distance, climbing the mountain slowly, its lights sweeping back and forth across the curves. When the vehicle finally reached my location, I could see it was an older pickup truck. I waved like a madman, and the truck pulled into the gravel area, right behind my rental car. Through the rear window, I could make out a single silhouette in the driver's seat, but the person made no move to get out or acknowledge my presence. I walked over toward the truck and raised my hand showing appreciation that they stopped. The driver's window was down, and I could see a middle-aged man with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. He didn't make any attempt to get out, so I started explaining my situation and hoping that he'd help me. The man listened, but didn't say a word. Once I finished speaking, he simply nodded and mumbled something along the lines that he'd be right back. The truck pulled away and headed back down from where it had come from, leaving me once again completely alone. My best guess was that he was going to find a spot with cell reception and call in for help, but to be honest, I had no idea what was happening. 20 minutes passed before I heard another vehicle approaching. It was again coming from the same direction, so I was certain it was either the old pickup truck or somebody that had been alerted and was here to help me. Once the vehicle pulled into the gravel area, I saw that it wasn't the same old truck. It was a van, white and windowless except for the front cab. It pulled into the overlook and parked in front of my car. After a few seconds, 2 men got out. The men didn't say anything and started walking toward me. One was tall and thin, the other shorter but stockier. I asked if they were here to help with my car trouble. The shorter man responded that they had heard about my situation and wanted to see if they could assist. The taller man started examining my vehicle. He asked where I was traveling from and where I was headed, to which I gave honest answers. The shorter man suggested that I ride with them to the nearest town, while his partner stayed with my car to make sure it wouldn't get stolen. While the offer did sound reasonable, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I thanked them for the offer, but insisted I'd rather wait for professional roadside assistance and asked them if they could alert them. The tall man pointed out that cell service was non-existent in this area, and that I could be stranded for days before anyone else happened to drive by. At one stage, I glanced over to the van. That's when I noticed that it didn't have a license plate. This immediately set off alarm bells in my head. The men seemed to notice this and started moving toward me, saying that it would be in my best interest if I would do as they said to make this as painless as possible. In a split-second decision, just before one of the men was about to grab my arm, I sprinted toward the edge of the overlook, where the ground dropped steeply into the forest below. I could hear the men shouting behind me, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth as they tried to find me between the trees. I half ran, half slid, half fell down the mountainside for a few hundred yards, before finding a cluster of large boulders to hide behind. I hid there for at least half an hour. Then, I started moving further back down the mountain until I found a trail that, nearly 6 hours later, took me to a small town at the base of the mountain. When I finally got phone service, I immediately called the sheriff's department, who showed up to take my statement and get me to my car. Once we arrived at the gravel area, the white van was gone without a trace, but my rental vehicle was there with its hood up and an empty engine bay. Since the van had arrived without license plates, the only thing I could provide were the looks of the men and the model of the van, to the best of my knowledge. Luckily, my insurance covered the costs of the stolen engine parts, but it was the last time I ever went up that mountain.